By the end of the 1880s, the ascent of a republican regime in France had been secured, and with it, a new sense of national revival swept the country. With the Republic now placed on a more solid footing, political elites began to turn their eyes further afield, looking for other sources that might strengthen the government and renew confidence in the nation. In this respect, the empire had something to offer, and during the 1880s, Republican politicians began considering the extent to which the French Empire and imperial mission could equally be republicanized. Republicans were not reticent in expressing their belief that colonial expansion could restore glory and confidence to the country, effacing the humiliations suffered in 1871. In a more practical sense, it was argued that colonies would furnish new markets and sources of wealth to assist in France's economic recovery. Republicans also suggested that colonial conquest could offer some compensation for the demoralizing loss of Alsace and Lorraine. For a vanquished people, the only revered politic is the politic of colonial expansion, as one politician put it in 1882. Not all Republicans, however, agreed with this new imperial project. More cautious thinkers worried that pursuing a revived imperialism would only distract policymakers from the challenges they faced at home. Getting entangled in foreign conflicts and exhausting the French military overseas failed to acknowledge the German threat right across the eastern border. Patriotic revanchists, licking their wounds after the Franco-Prussian War, saw little value in the imperial idea. In the early 1880s, however, the pro-colonial faction was in power, and their key spokesman was none other than Jules Ferry, the acting prime minister. Ferry had been concerned with expanding French influence in North Africa and providing additional security for Algeria. To this end, in 1881, when members of the Khmer Tribal Confederation attacked French outposts in eastern Algeria from across the Tunisian border, Ferry used it as a pretext for military intervention. In April, French forces invaded Tunisia under the pretext of breaking up the Khmer rebel organization. As the French began occupying large parts of Tunisian territory, native forces mounted a resistance movement, prompting the military to suppress the insurrection and place Tunisia firmly under French control. By November, Tunisia was declared a French protectorate, extending French influence right up to Ottoman Libya. Following upon the success of the Tunisian campaign, another opportunity presented itself to Ferry, this time in Asia. In 1881, the French government had sent a small military expedition under the command of Henri Rivière to Hanoi to investigate complaints made by the Vietnamese government against French traders. To the embarrassment of the French government, Rivière launched an unauthorized military attack against Hanoi when he arrived, believing he could impose French policies through force on Vietnam. This initial assault quickly transformed into a protracted military conflict, as the Vietnamese court appealed to a small band of well-disciplined mercenaries, collectively known as the Black Flags, to fend off the French. Within months, the Chinese imperial government, which had no intention of tolerating a French presence directly on its border, were also funneling covert aid to the Black Flags. For the next 3 years, the French military fought an unconventional war against a joint Sino-Vietnamese resistance movement, as they attempted to clamp down on northern Vietnam. The slow pace of victory brought sharp criticism against Jules Ferry at home. The war had never been officially declared by the government, and many Republicans believed that the management of the war was reflecting poorly on the country. Worse still was the fact that the unpopularity of Ferry's government was encouraging a revival of radical republicanism, with radical candidates winning seats in the National Assembly. This new generation of radicals, while not preaching revolution, did desire to challenge the idea of a conservative republic, and they immediately took aim at the military campaign in Vietnam in order to discredit Ferry. As luck would have it, in 1885, the radicals obtained secret correspondence from within the War Ministry, detailing the poor French performance against the Chinese forces. Hoping to embarrass the government and force Ferry's resignation, they made these military communiques public, generating a political crisis that became publicized as the Tonkin Affair. Ferry was called before the assembly to answer for his actions, and at the session he gave a strident defense of France's colonial expansion and the war in Asia. While he spoke about the economic advantages and the need to revive the nation through imperialism, the centerpiece of his defense hinged upon France's mission to spread civilization and emancipate less fortunate countries suffering under cruel dictatorships. As Ferry told his audience, the superior races have a right because they have a duty. It is their duty to civilize the inferior races. Such a blatant defense of France's colonial interests and grandeur did not save Ferry, who was forced out of office shortly after the war with China was concluded. Yet if the Tonkin Affair destroyed Ferry's political career, it did succeed in bringing Vietnam under French control and winning a new Indo-Chinese protectorate for the Republic. More to the point, the scandal had compelled Ferry to give a strident defense of France's civilizing mission before the Parliament, announcing a specific brand of Republican imperialism that would mix notions of spreading civilized Republican values with ideas of conquest and violence against those deemed uncivilized. If France was in fact a republic, it was also going to be, without question, a colonial republic. The contentious atmosphere of the mid-1880s raised new challenges, but it also exposed certain weaknesses that persisted within the Third Republic as well. As opposition mounted, conservatives and royalists, who had never supported the Republic to begin with, believed the time might be ripe to mount a campaign of their own, one aimed at destroying the Republic once and for all. In seeking a possible strategy, conservatives set their sights on Georges Boulanger, a French general who had recently been dismissed as war minister in 1887. Boulanger had shown himself to be a patriot while serving in the war ministry, and was reputed to be the most Republican of all the generals in the French military. His self-fashioning was evident in the broad gestures and reform policies he had enacted while minister. During his tenure, Boulanger had painted French military facilities in the colors of the tricolor to nurture nationalist feelings. He had banned the velvet collars traditionally worn by French officers in the name of equality. Yet his most appealing quality was perhaps his die-hard revanchist stance. Boulanger had done a great deal of saber-rattling from his position in the War Ministry, giving fiery speeches that encouraged seeking revenge on Germany, building military garrisons on the Franco-German border, and staging large military parades intended to incite nationalist feelings. His revanchism was so strong that many feared he might provoke a war with Germany if the general was not tamed, a factor that played heavily into his dismissal in 1887. In spite of his stated patriotism and dedication to the Republic, Royalists believed that they could use this ambitious general to further their own ends. His nationalist rhetoric had made him popular with the left, and conservatives were not blind to the fact that French voters had a penchant for nationalist military figures who rode horses and made grand declarations regarding French honor and glory. In no uncertain terms, Boulanger had all the marks of another Bonaparte, one whose thirst for power could easily make him a tool of conservatives. Moreover, in 1887, another political scandal had just broken, further discrediting the Republican government. That year, the president Jules Grévy was charged with corruption when it became known that his son-in-law had promised posts to the Legion of Honor in return for bribes. More embarrassing was the fact that he had written these letters on official presidential stationery. When Grévy got wind of these letters, he was shocked. To cover up a possible scandal, he had the letters destroyed and ordered his son-in-law to write new ones that were not incriminating. When this cover-up became known and the letters were proven to be forgeries, the impact was devastating. Not only was the president's son-in-law soliciting bribes, the president himself had obstructed justice. It was clear that Grévy would have to resign. Royalists now believed that the time had come to deal a death blow to the Republic, and Boulanger was going to be their instrument. With the Grévy scandal breaking, Royalists approached Boulanger and convinced him that the Republic was on the brink of collapse. It would be advantageous, they informed him, to throw in his lot with the Conservatives, who would assure him a good post in the new government that was formed once the Republic fell apart. To this end, the Conservatives had Boulanger run for election to the National Assembly in 1887. His electoral speeches criticized the current government and the parliamentary system in general, with Boulanger giving public speeches mounted on a horse and promoting an aggressive and Germanophobic nationalism. Upon winning the elections, Boulanger refused to serve, insisting he would only take office once the government was reformed. These protest votes became the base of Boulanger's campaign, encouraging voters to cast a ballot for him in protest against Republican corruption. Conservatives believed that this strategy would clearly demonstrate both Boulanger's popularity and encourage political resistance. However, Royalists were not the only ones to support this idea. The radical left and the Socialists equally came out to support Boulanger, believing they could use this Napoleon-like figure as a battering ram against the bourgeois Republican regime in power. Boulanger's campaign manager devised a thoroughly modern campaign for the candidate. Large, colorful posters advertising his candidacy were hung throughout the country, while the general undertook a whistle-stop tour of the countryside to give speeches and rally supporters. Boulanger's protest campaigns continued for 2 years as the general won elections and then refused to sit. By 1889, it was clear that Boulanger posed a severe threat to the stability and credibility of the Republic. In January, after one of his electoral victories, a large crowd assembled in Paris, cheering the general and demanding that he carry out a coup against the corrupt regime. While Boulanger did not stage a coup and continued to run his protest campaign, it was clear that something had to be done lest the Republic crumble. Hoping to undermine the rampant Boulangist movement, the government began suppressing his propaganda network. New laws were enacted banning large outdoor political demonstrations, while older laws forbidding secret political organizations were revived in an effort to undercut financial support for the Boulangists. Under these laws, members of Boulanger's campaign team were arrested and prosecuted for running a secret political organization. Soon enough, the government charged Boulanger himself with treasonable activities. These charges were tenuous at best and would not stick if brought to trial. But in the spring of 1889, Boulanger, fearing he was to be arrested, fled to Belgium. His flight across the border strongly discredited the Boulangist movement. With his political and military career ruined, Boulanger traveled to Brussels that September, and at the grave of his former mistress, drew out a revolver and shot himself, putting a permanent end to the Boulangist threat. The Third Republic had managed to weather the Boulangist storm, which had threatened to undermine its credibility. This victory, as inglorious as it may seem, ensured that France would remain a republic in spite of the numerous enemies in the country who desired to see its downfall. The Boulanger Affair demonstrated the unpopularity of the regime among socialists and conservatives in the country. But it had equally shown the threat a popular and quasi-Napoleonic politician could pose to Republican institutions. Boulanger's fall from grace in 1889 and his subsequent suicide gave the government a new lease on life. But it was a short reprieve at best, as another scandal began to loom on the horizon. In 1894, it came to the attention of the government that secret military intelligence regarding French armaments was being funneled to Berlin. The German government had apparently placed a spy in the French General Staff. Without knowing exactly who the spy was, officials came to suspect one Captain Alfred Dreifus, a Jewish artillery officer. These suspicions had more to do with the fact that Dreifus was a Jew, rather than any actual evidence suggesting his complicity. In fact, once it was decided that Dreifus was the culprit, the military forged treasonous documents outlining the captain's correspondence with the German embassy in Paris. In December, Dreifus was tried for treason and sentenced to lifetime imprisonment on Devil's Island, a penal colony in French Guiana. Prior to his deportation, he was publicly stripped of his army rank as a final humiliation, with a superior ripping his medals from his uniform before a crowd and then breaking his saber over his knee. The following year, however, evidence emerged that perhaps Dreifus had been wrongly accused. The new chief of the French military intelligence, Colonel Picard, indicated that the espionage had been perpetrated by another man. The French High Command had no interest in this information. They knew that acknowledging their unjustified suspicions and admitting they had sentenced an innocent man to Devil's Island would be a public embarrassment and discredit the military. Picard was advised to stay silent on the issue, and as an extra precaution, he was transferred to Tunisia to ensure that the details never came to light. Yet contrary to these expectations, the information was leaked to the press, presenting the possibility of yet another political scandal which could threaten to undermine support for the Republic and tarnish its reputation. With the press now reporting on the story, the government had little choice other than to address it. Officials sought to discourage a public investigation into the case, knowing full well it would call the entire judicial system which had sentenced Dreyfus into question. It was better to try and keep the scandal within official channels, rather than jeopardize the institutions of the perpetually fragile Republic. Alfred Dreyfus's brother, Mathieu, realized that the government was going to be of no help in freeing his brother, and therefore he decided to pursue the case through other channels. Turning to the political opposition, he enlisted the support of die-hard Republican newspaper editors like Georges Clemenceau and the leader of the French Socialist Party, Jean Jaurès. To bring the scandal to public attention, Clemenceau had his paper publish a front-page story on the case. It was penned by none other than Émile Zola. In an open letter, Zola launched a scathing attack against the government, dubbing his article J'accuse. It contained a long list of illegal activities and violations carried out by the government to subvert the truth about the Dreyfus case. The letter shocked the public and amounted to an open declaration of opposition against the current government, drawing public attention to the case. Clemenceau and Jaurès placed themselves at the head of an opposition faction that took the title of the Dreifusard. By necessity, the government came to support an anti-Dreifusard faction which desired to keep the case closed. As the incident became a political matter, the Dreyfus case became the Dreifus Affair, one that polarized French society. The implications of the affair extended far beyond the false charges brought against Alfred Dreyfus. Dreifusards claimed they stood for free thought and a dedication to the ideals of the French Revolution. It was, they insisted, essential to combat the authoritarian and conservative forces which threatened the integrity of France. They equally raised questions regarding anti-Semitism in the country and the nation's dedication to equal rights for all citizens. On the opposite side, the anti-Dreyfusard faction drew support from anti-Republican groups, royalists, right-wing nationalists, and staunch Catholics who had never accepted the idea of a Republican France. French society, once again, was divided along the old lines of the Revolution and the Conservatives, the Republicans and the Royalists, the anti-clerics, and those who supported the Church. In this battle, the actual Dreyfus case itself was secondary. It provided a platform around which these two oppositional groups could rally and express their political grievances as France once again became sharply divided along ideological lines. By 1900, it was the Dreifusards who emerged victorious, and upon taking control of the government, they immediately subjected the Dreyfus case to a second hearing, eventually having the captain exonerated. With their campaign successful, the The Dreyfusards next decided to punish the disloyal opposition and strengthen the Republic. Those responsible for orchestrating the Dreyfus case were purged from the military, and as an extra punishment against the army, compulsory military service was reduced from 3 to 2 years. Secondly, in 1902, a new association law was passed that required official authorization in order to form organizations. This law placed restrictions primarily on religious associations as a way to punish the Church and conservative Catholics for its anti-Dreyfusard stance. 10,000 religious schools were closed down, while various other Catholic groups were declared illegal. The Dreifus Affair had been directed against the conservative government and the army, and with the protests had come a significant anti-nationalist rhetoric. Socialists, due to their belief in the international workers' movement, were naturally against nationalism, which they believed was a bourgeois ideology used to divide the working classes, as Marx had claimed. Dreyfusard Republicans had, however, equally adopted an anti-nationalist stance as they touted their anti-clerical and anti-militarist platform. Republicans who held a revanchist platform continued to insist that France should not be concerned with colonial expansion and should concentrate on the German threat directly on the continent. In this respect, they desired a passive foreign policy that would provide security for the Republic, not an aggressive policy of expansion that would inflame international tensions, provoke war, and ignore the German menace across the Rhine. Yet this passive stance became increasingly problematic to maintain as international rivalries intensified in the early 20th century. Imperial Germany did not hide its aspirations of pursuing an aggressive Weltpolitik, one that aimed to secure German predominance not only in Europe, but across the world. This threat to France and its empire played upon growing fears of French weakness, but it also raised the specter of another war, evoking painful memories of the previous defeat. The right played upon these fears, adopting a nationalist platform that accused the left of weakening the country at a moment when the German threat was becoming ever more apparent. Anti-German rhetoric suffused politics, and it appeared that it was the right which was benefiting from it. It did not help that socialists were becoming more active in their protests and demonstrations, leading many to believe that a brewing social revolution was on the horizon. As socialism came to pose a threat to stability, left-wing Republicans felt it best to distance themselves from the movement. The former Dreyfusard, Georges Clemenceau, prime minister after 1906, took a hardline approach when dealing with the growing strikes and worker protests. He had few reservations in calling in the police and breaking up these demonstrations. The need to distance the Republican left from the socialists encouraged a more nationalist rhetoric. Clemenceau was also aware of the German threat, and by the early 1900s, he was convinced that a war between the two powers was inevitable. The right-wing nationalist, Charles Maurras, had begun fanning the flames of a rabid anti-German nationalism. His popular movement, l'Action Française, was a militant Catholic and royalist group, which constantly played upon fears of national degeneration, the threat of socialism, and the impending German attack that would destroy the country. In his opinion, the only way to strengthen the nation was to revive the monarchy and unify the nation through its Catholic heritage. While the Action Française was one of the most vociferous critics of the Republic and often organized anti-Semitic and anti-government mobs that caused trouble in the streets, this was not what alarmed the government most. What was alarming was the fact that the movement had begun to attract the middle classes. And this said more about the unpopularity of the government and its inability to quell certain fears than it did about the popularity of Marat's racist and ultra-conservative nationalist ideology. Conscious of the growing threat posed by Germany, Republicans were willing to embrace the new national revival taking root in the country. In 1912, the new Prime Minister, Raymond Poincaré, set the tone. An inveterate Republican, he promised to take a tough stance on the German issue. Born in Lorraine, Poincaré had never forgotten the humiliating defeat which had stained the nation's honor. In his speeches and writings, he promoted a revanchist platform, and under his stewardship, the Republicans moved fully into the nationalist camp. They used the press to stir up support for rearmament plans and fed anti-German sentiments. After 1912, tensions in France ran high, as an impending conflict with Germany began to look inevitable. In this atmosphere, it was the revanchist trend that won out, as the Republic set to the task of preparing and arming itself in the midst of social pleas for peace and worker solidarity across nations. Men like Poincaré were under no illusions. Europe was going to war, and they were determined not to repeat the errors of the past when it came to the German threat across the border.